Chapter 6. "I guess I owe you thanks," Alan said. "If they had hauled me off, I'd be in real trouble." Hawks nodded. "They're very quick to lock people up when they don't have work cards. But police salaries are notoriously low. A 5-credit bill slipped to the right man at the right time can work wonders." 5 credits, was it? Here. Alan started to fumble in his pocket, but Hawks checked him with a wave of his hand. "Never mind. I'll write it off to profit and loss. What's your name, Spacer, and what brings you to York City?" "I'm Alan Donnell of the starship Valhalla. I'm an unspecialized crewman. I came over from the Enclave to look for my brother." Hawks' lean face assumed an expression of deep interest. "He's a Starman too?" "He was." "Was?" "He jumped ship last time we were here. That was 9 years ago, Earth time. I'd like to find him, though, even though he's so much older now." "How old is he now?" 26. I'm 17. We used to be twins, you see, but the contraction, you understand about the contraction, don't you?" Hawks nodded thoughtfully, eyes half closed. Yes, I follow you. While you made your last space jump, he grew old on Earth, and you want to find him and put him back on your ship. Is that it?" "That's right, or at least talk to him and find out if he's all right where he is. But I don't know where to start looking. This city is so big, and there are so many other cities all over Earth." Hawks shook his head. "You've come to the right one. The Central Directory Matrix is here. You'll be able to find out where he's registered by the code number on his work card. Unless," Hawks said speculatively, "he doesn't have a work card. Then you're in trouble." "Isn't everyone supposed to have a work card?" "I don't," Hawks said. "But—" "You need a work card to hold a job. But to get a job you have to pass guild exams. And in order to take the exams you have to find a sponsor who's already in the guild. But you have to post a bond for your sponsor too, 5,000 credits. And unless you have the work card and you have been working, you don't have 5,000 credits, so you can't post a bond and get a work card. See? Round and round." Alan's head swam. "Is that what they meant when they said I was unrotational?" "No, that's something else. I'll get to that in a second. But you see the work setup? The guilds are virtually hereditary, even the Fruit Vendors Guild. It's next to impossible for a newcomer to crack into a guild, and it's pretty tough for a man in one guild to move up a notch. You see, Earth's a terribly overcrowded planet, and the only way to avoid cutthroat job competition is to make sure it's tough to get a job. It's rough on a Starman trying to bull his way into the system." "You mean Steve may not have gotten a work card? In that case, how will I be able to find him?" "It's harder," Hawks said. "But there's also a registry of free status men without cards. He isn't required to register there, but if he did you'd be able to track him down eventually. If he didn't, I'm afraid you're out of luck. You just can't find a man on Earth if he doesn't want to be found." "Free status? Isn't that what the policeman said I was in?" Hawks nodded. "Sure, I'm free status. Out of choice, though, not necessity. But that doesn't matter much right now. Let's go over to the Central Directory Matrix building and see if we can't find any trail of your brother." They rose. Alan saw that Hawks was tall like himself. He walked with easygoing grace. Questioningly, Alan twitched his shoulder blade in the signal that meant, "What do you think of this guy, Rat?" "Stick with him," Rat signaled back. "He sounds okay." The streets seemed a great deal less terrifying now that Alan had a companion, someone who knew his way around. He didn't have the feeling that all eyes were on him anymore. He was just one of the crowd. It was good to have Hawks at his side, even if he didn't fully trust the older man. "The directory building's way across town," Hawks said. "We can't walk it. Undertube or overshoot?" What? I said, do you want to take the undertube or the overshoot? Or doesn't it matter to you what kind of transportation we take? Alan shrugged. One's as good as any other. Hawks fished a coin out of his pocket and tossed it up. Heads for overshoot, he said, and caught the coin on the back of his left hand. He peered at it. Heads it is. We take the overshoot. This way. They ducked into the lobby of the nearest building and took the elevator to the top floor. Hawks stopped a man in a blue uniform and said, Where's the nearest chute pickup? Take the North Corridor Bridge across to the next building. The pickup's there. Right. Hawks led his way down the corridor, up a staircase, and through a door. With sudden alarm, Alan found himself on one of the bridges linking the skyscrapers. The bridge was no more than a ribbon of plastic with handholds at each side. It swayed gently in the breeze. You'd better not look down, Hawks said. It's 50 stories to the bottom. Alan kept his eyes stiffly forward. There was a good-sized crowd gathered on the top of the adjoining building, and he saw a metal platform of some kind. A vendor came up to them. Alan thought he might be selling tickets, but instead he held forth a tray of soft drinks. Hawks bought one. Alan started to say he didn't want one when he felt a sharp kick in his ankle, and he hurriedly changed his mind and produced a coin. When the vendor was gone, Hawks said, Remind me to explain rotation to you when we get aboard the chute. And here it comes now. Alan turned and saw a silvery torpedo come whistling through the air and settle in the landing rack of the platform. It looked like a jet-powered vessel of some kind. A line formed, and Hawks stuffed a ticket into Alan's hand. I have a month's supply of them, he said. It's cheaper that way. They found a pair of seats together and strapped themselves in. With a roar and a hiss, the overshoot blasted away from the landing platform, and almost immediately came to rest on another building some distance away. We've just traveled about half a mile, Hawks said. This ship really moves. A jet-propelled omnibus that traveled over the roofs of the buildings, Alan thought. Clever. He said, Isn't there any public surface transportation in the cities? Nope. It was all banned about 50 years ago on account of the congestion. Taxis and everything. You can still use a private car in some parts of the city, of course, but the only people who own them are those who like to impress their neighbors. Most of us take the undertube or the overshoot to get around. The chute blasted off from its third stop and picked up passengers at its fourth. Alan glanced up front and saw the pilot peering over an elaborate radar system. Westbound chutes travel 100 feet over the rooftops. Eastbound ones 200. There hasn't been a major accident in years. But about this rotation, that's part of our new economic plan, which is keep the money moving, savings discouraged, spending's the thing now. The guilds are really pushing it. Instead of buying one piece of fruit from a vendor, buy two. Spend, spend, spend. It's a little tough on the people in free status. We don't offer anything for sale, so we don't benefit much. But we don't amount to 1% of the population, so who cares about us? You mean it's sort of subversive not to spend money, is that it? Alan asked. Hawks nodded. You get in trouble if you're too openly penny-pinching. Keep the credits flowing, that's the way to be popular around here. That had been his original mistake, Alan thought. He saw he had a lot to learn about this strange, unfriendly world if he were going to stay here long. He wondered if anyone had missed him back at the Enclave yet. Maybe it won't take too long to find Steve, he thought. I should have left a note for Dad explaining I'd be back, but... Here we are, Hawks said, nudging him. The door in the overshoot's side opened, and they got out quickly. They were on another rooftop. 10 minutes later they stood outside an immense building, whose walls were sleek slabs of green pellucite, shining with a radiant inner warmth of their own. The building must have been 100 stories high or more. It terminated in a burnished spire. This is it, Hawks said. The Central Directory building. We'll try the standard matrix first. A little dizzy, Alan followed without discussing the matter. Hawks led him through a vast lobby big enough to hide the Valhalla in, past throngs of Earthers, into a huge hall lined on all sides by computer banks. "Let's take this booth here," Hawks suggested. They stepped into it. The door clicked shut automatically behind them. There was a row of blank forms in a metal rack against the inside of the door. Hawks pulled one out. Alan looked at it. It said, "Central Directory Matrix Information Requisition 1067432. Standard Series." Hawks took a pen from the rack. "We have to fill this out. What's your brother's full name?" "Steve Donnell," he spelled it. "Year of birth?" Alan paused. 3576, he said finally. Hawks frowned, but wrote it down anyway. "Work card number? Well, we don't know that. And they want 5 or 6 other numbers too. We'll just have to skip them. Better give me a full physical description as of the last time you saw him." Alan thought a moment. "He looked pretty much like me. Height 73 inches, weight 172 or so, reddish blonde hair, and so on." "Don't you have a gene record?" Blankly, Alan said, A what?" Hawks scowled. "I forgot. I keep forgetting you're a spacer. Well, if he's not using his own name anymore, it might make things really tough. Gene records make absolute identification possible, but if you don't have one..." Whistling tunelessly, Hawks filled out the rest of the form. When it came to "reason for application," he wrote in "tracing of missing relative." "That just about covers it," he said finally. "It's a pretty lame application, but if we're lucky we may find him." He rolled up the gray form, shoved it into a gray metal tube, and dropped it into a slot in the wall. "What happens now?" Alan asked. "Now we wait. The application goes downstairs and the big computer goes to work on it. First thing they'll do is kick aside all the cards of men named Steve Donnell. Then they'll check them all against the physical description I supplied. Soon as they find a man who fits the bill, they'll stat his card and send it up here to us. We copy down the televector number and have them trace him down." "The what number?" "You'll see," Hawks said, grinning. "It's a good system. Just wait." They waited. 1 minute, 2, 3. "I hope I'm not keeping you from something important," Alan said, breaking a long, uncomfortable silence. "It's really good of you to take all this time, but I wouldn't want to inconvenience you if..." "If I didn't want to help you," Hawks said sharply, "I wouldn't be doing it. I'm free status, you know. That means I don't have any boss except me, Max Hawks, Esquire. It's one of the few compensations I have for the otherwise lousy deal life handed me. So if I choose to waste an hour or two helping you find your brother, don't worry yourself about it." A bell rang once, and a gentle light glowed over the slot. Hawks reached in and scooped out the container that sat there. Inside he found a rolled-up slip of paper. He pulled it out and read the message typed on it several times, pursing his lips. "Well, did they find him?" "Read it for yourself," Hawks said. He pushed the sheet over to Alan. It said in crisp capital letters, "A search of the files reveals that no work card has been issued on Earth in the past 10 years to Steve Donnell, male, with the required physical characteristics." Alan's face fell. He tossed the slip to the table and said, "Well, what do we do now?" "Now," Hawks said, "we go upstairs to the cubbyhole where they keep the free status people registered. We go through the same business there. I didn't really expect to find your brother here, but it was worth a look. It's next to impossible for a ship-jumping starman to buy into a guild. and get a work card. Suppose he's not registered with the free status people? Hawks smiled patiently. Then, my dear friend, you go back to your ship with your mission incomplete. If he's not listed upstairs, there's no way on earth you could possibly find him. Chapter 7. The sign over the office door said Registry of Free Status Labor Force, and under that, room 1104. Hawks nudged the door open and they went in. It was not an imposing room. A fat, pasty-faced man sat behind a scarred neoplast desk, scribbling his signature on forms that he was taking from an immense stack. The room was lined with records of one sort or another, untidy, poorly assembled. There was dust everywhere. The man at the desk looked up as they entered and nodded to Hawks. "Hello, Max. Making an honest man of yourself at last?" "Not on your life," Hawks said. "I came up here to do some checking. Alan, this is Hines McIntosh, keeper of the records. Hines, want you to meet a Starman friend of mine, Alan Donnell." "Starman, eh?" McIntosh's pudgy face went suddenly grave. "Well, boy, I hope you know how to get along on an empty stomach. Free status life isn't easy." "No," Alan said. "You don't under—" Hawks cut him off. "He's just in the city on leave, Hines. His ship blasts off in another couple of days and he figures to be on it. But he's trying to track down his brother who jumped ship 9 years back." McIntosh nodded. "I suppose you drew a blank in the big room downstairs?" "Yes." "Not surprising. We get these ship-jumping starmen all the time up here. They never do get work cards, it seems. What's that thing on your shoulder, boy?" "He's from Bellatrix 7. "Intelligent?" "I should say so," Rat burst in indignantly. "Just because I have a certain superficial physiological resemblance to a particular species of unpleasant Terran rodent." McIntosh chuckled and said, "Ease up. I didn't mean to insult you, friend. But you'll have to apply for a visa if you're going to stay here more than 3 days." Alan frowned. "Visa?" Hawks cut in. "The boy's going back on his ship, I told you. He won't need a visa, or the alien either." "Be that as it may," McIntosh said. "So you're looking for your brother, boy. Give me the specifications now. Name, date of birth, and all the rest." "His name is Steve Donnell, sir. Born 3576. He jumped ship in—" "Born when, did you say?" "They're spacers," Hawks pointed out quietly. McIntosh shrugged. "Go ahead." "Jumped ship in 3867, I think. It's hard to tell what year it is on Earth. Any physical description?" "He was my twin," Alan said. "Identical twin." McIntosh jotted down the data Alan gave him and transferred it to a punch card. "I don't remember any spacers of that name," he said, "but 9 years is a long time. And we get so many starmen coming up here to take out free status." "You do?" "Oh, 15 or 20 a year, at least, and that's in this office alone. They're forever getting stranded on leave and losing their ships. Why, there was one boy who was robbed and beaten in the Frisco Enclave and didn't wake up for a week. Naturally, he missed his ship, and no other starship would sign him on. He's on free status now, of course. Well, let's see about Donnell, Steve, male, shall we? You realize the law doesn't require free status people to register with us, and so we may not necessarily have any data on him in our computer files." "I realize that," Alan said tightly. He wished the chubby records keeper would stop talking and start looking for Steve's records. It was getting along toward late afternoon now. He had come across from the Enclave around noontime, and certainly it would be at least 1600 by now. He was getting hungry, and he knew he would have to start making plans for spending the night somewhere if he didn't go back to the Enclave. McIntosh pulled himself laboriously out of his big web-work cradle and wheezed his way across the room to a computer chute. He dropped the card in. "It'll take a few minutes for them to make the search," he said, turning. He looked in both directions and went on. "Care for a drink? Just to pass the time." Hawkes grinned. "Good old Heinzie. What's in the inkwell today?" "Scotch, bottled in bond, best syntho stuff to come out of Caledonia in the last century." McIntosh shuffled back to his desk and found 3 dingy glasses in one of the drawers. He set them out and uncorked a dark blue bottle, plainly labeled ink. He poured a shot for Hawkes, and then a second shot. As he started to push it toward Alan, the Starman shook his head. "Sorry, but I don't drink. Crewmen aren't allowed to have liquor aboard ships. Regulation." "Oh, but you're off duty now." Alan shook his head a second time, shrugging. McIntosh took the drink himself and put the unused third glass back in the drawer. "Here's to Steve Donnell," he said, lifting his glass high. "May he have had the good sense to register his name up here." They drank. Alan watched. Suddenly the bell clanged and a tube rolled out of the computer chute. Alan waited tensely while McIntosh crossed the room again, drew out the contents of the tube, and scanned them. The fat man's face broke into a smile. "You're in luck, Starman. Your brother did register with us. Here's the stat of his papers." Alan looked at them. The photostat was titled "Application for Admission to Free Status Labor Force," and the form had been filled out in a handwriting Alan recognized immediately as Steve's. Bold, untidy, the letters slanting slightly backwards. He had given his name as Steve Donnell, his date of birth as 3576, his chronological age as 17. He had listed his former occupation as Starman. The application was dated 4 June 3867, and a stamp notation on the margin declared that free status had been granted on 11 June 3867. "So he did register," Alan said. "But now what? How do we find him?" Hawkes reached for the photostat. "Here, let me take a look." He squinted to make out the small print, then nodded and wrote down something. "His televector number's a local one." So far, so good. He turned the form over and glanced at the reproduced photo of Steve on the back. He looked up, comparing it with Alan. "Dead ringers, these two. But I'll bet this one doesn't look much like this anymore, not after 9 years of free status." "It only pays off for the lucky few, eh, Max?" McIntosh asked slyly. Hawkes grinned. "Some of us make out all right. You have to have the knack, though. You can get awfully hungry otherwise. Come on, kid, let's go up a little higher now. Up to the televector files. Thanks for the help, Heinzie. You're a pal." "Just doing my job," McIntosh said. "See you tonight as usual?" "I doubt it," Hawkes replied. "I'm going to take the night off. I have it coming to me." "That leaves the coast clear for us amateurs, doesn't it? Maybe I'll come out ahead tonight." Hawkes smiled coldly. "Maybe you will. Let's go, kid." They took the lift tube outside and rode it as high as it went. It opened out into the biggest room Alan had ever seen, bigger even than the main registry downstairs, a vast affair, perhaps 100 feet high and 400 feet on the side. And every inch of those feet was lined with computer elements. "This is the nerve center of the world," Hawkes said as they went in. "By asking the right questions, you can find out where anybody in the world happens to be at this very moment." "How can they do that?" Hawkes nudged a tiny sliver of metal embedded in a ring on his finger. "Here's my televector transmitter. Everybody who has a work card or free status carries one, either on a ring or a locket around his neck or somewhere else. Some people have them surgically embedded in their bodies. They give off resonance waves, each one absolutely unique. There's about 1 chance in a quadrillion of a duplicate pattern. The instruments here can pick up a given pattern and tell you exactly where the person you're looking for is. So we can find Steve without much trouble. Probably. Hawk's face darkened. I've known it to happen that the televector pattern picks up a man who's been at the bottom of the sea for 5 years. But don't let me scare you. Steve's probably in good shape. He took out the slip of paper on which he had jotted down Steve's televector code number and transferred the information to an application blank. This system, Alan said, it means no one can possibly hide anywhere on Earth unless he removes his televector transmitter. You can't do that, though. Strictly illegal. An alarm goes out whenever someone gets more than 6 inches from his transmitter, and he's picked up on suspicion. It's an automatic cancellation of your work card if you try to fool with your transmitter, or if you're free status, a fine of 10,000 credits. And if you can't pay the fine? Then you work it off, government indenture, at 1,000 credits a year, chopping up rocks in the Antarctica penitentiary. The system's flawless. It has to be. With Earth as overpopulated as it is, you need some system of tracking down people, otherwise crime would be 10 times as prevalent as it is now. There still is crime? Oh, sure. There's always somebody who needs food bad enough to rob for it, even though it means a sure arrest. Murder's a little less common. Hawks fed the requisition into the slot. You'd be surprised what a deterrent the televector registry system is. It's not so easy to run off to South America and hide when anybody at all can come in here and find out exactly where you are. A moment went by. Then the slot clicked and a glossy pink slip came rolling out. Alan looked at it. It said, Televector Registry, 21 May, 3876. Location of Donnell, Steve, YC83-10J6490K 37618. Time 1643.21. There followed a street map covering some 15 square blocks, and a bright red dot was imprinted in the center of the map. Hawks glanced at the map and smiled. I thought that was where he would be. Where's that? 68th Avenue and 423rd Street. Is that where he lives? Asked Alan. Oh no, the televector tells you where he is right now. I'd venture to say that was his, place of business. Alan frowned. What are you talking about? That happens to be the address of the Atlas Games Parlor. Your brother Steve probably spends most of his working day there, when he can get enough cash to get in. I know the place. It's a cheap joint where the payoffs are low but easy. It's the kind of place a low-budget man would frequent. You mean Steve's a gambler? Hawks smiled. Most free status men are. It's one of the few ways we can earn a living without getting a work card. There isn't any gamblers' guild. There are a few other ways too, but they're a lot less savory, and the televector surveillance makes it hard for a man to stay in business for long. Alan moistened his lips. What do you do? Gamble. I'm in the upper brackets, though. As I say, some of us have the knack. I doubt if your brother does, though. After 9 years, he wouldn't still be working the Atlas if he had any dough. Alan shrugged that off. How do we get there? I'd like to go right away. Patience, lad, Hawks murmured. There's plenty of time for that. When does your ship leave? Couple of days. Then we don't need to rush right over to the Atlas now. Let's get some food in ourselves first, then a good night's rest. We can go over there tomorrow. But my brother. Your brother, Hawks said, has been in New York City for 9 years, and I'll bet he spent every night for the last 8 of them sitting in Atlas. He'll keep till tomorrow. Let's get something to eat. Chapter 8. They ate in a dark and unappealing restaurant 3 blocks from the Central Directory Matrix building. The place was crowded, as all Earth places seemed to be. They stood on line for nearly half an hour before being shown to a grease-stained table in the back. The wall clock said 17:32. A robo-waiter approached them, holding a menu board in its metal hands. Hawks leaned forward and punched out his order. Alan took slightly longer about it, finally selecting protein steak, syntho coffee, and mixed vegetables. The robot clicked its acknowledgement and moved on to the next table. "So, my brother's a gambler," Alan began. Hawks nodded. "You say it as if you were saying, 'So my brother's a pickpocket,' or 'So my brother's a cut purse.' It's a perfectly legitimate way to make a living." Hawks' eyes hardened suddenly, and in a flat, quiet voice added, "The way to stay out of trouble on Earth is to avoid being preachy, son. This isn't a pretty world. There are too many people on it, and not many can afford the passage out to Gamma Leonis 4 or Algol 6 or some of the nice uncluttered colony worlds. So while you're in York City, keep your eyes wide and your mouth zippered, and don't turn your nose up at the sordid ways people make their livings." Alan felt his face go red, and he was happy to have the trays of food arrive at that moment, causing some sort of a distraction. "Sorry, Max, I didn't mean to sound preachy." "I know, kid. You lead a pretty sheltered life on those starships, and nobody can adjust to Earthside life in a day. How about a drink?" Alan started to say that he didn't drink, but kept the words back. He was on Earth now, not aboard the Valhalla. He wasn't required to keep ship's regs, and he didn't want to be trying to look superior. "Okay, how about a scotch? Is that the stuff McIntosh was drinking?" "Fair enough," Hawks said. He signaled for a robot waiter, and after a moment the robot slithered up to them. Hawks punched a lever on the robot's stomach, and the metal creature began to click and glow. An instant later a panel in its stomach slid open, and 2 glasses appeared within. The robot's wiry tentacles reached in, took out the drinks, and set them on the table. Hawks dropped a coin in a slot in the robot's side, and the machine bustled away, its service complete. "There you are," Hawks said, pointing to the glass of amber-colored liquid. "Drink up." As if to set an example, he lifted his own drink and tossed it down in one gulp, with obvious pleasure. Alan picked up the little glass and held it before his eyes, staring at the man opposite him through its translucent depths. Hawks appeared oddly distorted when viewed through the glass. He grinned. He tried to propose a toast, but couldn't think of any appropriate words, so he simply upended the glass and drained its contents. The stuff seemed to burn its way down his throat and explode in his stomach. The explosion rose through his gullet and into his brain. For a moment he felt as if the top of his head had been blown off. His eyes watered. "Pretty potent stuff." "It's the best there is," Hawks said. "Those boys really know the formulas." Alan felt a wave of dizziness, but it passed quickly. All that was left was a pleasant inner warmth now. He pulled his tray toward him and attacked the synthetic meat and vegetables. He ate quietly, making no attempt at conversation. Soft music bubbled up around them. He thought about his brother. "So Steve was a gambler, and doing poorly at it," Hawks said. He wondered if Steve would want to go back on the ship. He wondered also how it would be if Steve did agree to go back. The old comradeship would be gone, he realized sadly. They had shared everything for 17 years, grown up together, played together, worked together. Up till 6 weeks ago they had been so close that Alan could almost read Steve's mind, and Steve Alan's. They made a good team. But that was finished now. Steve would be a stranger to him aboard the Valhalla, an older, perhaps wiser man with 9 solid years of tough Earth life behind him. He would not be able to help but regard Alan as a kid, a greenhorn. It was natural. They would never be comfortable in each other's presence, with that old, easy familiarity that was so close to telepathy. That 9-year gulf would see to that. Thinking about your brother, aren't you? Alan blinked. How did you know? Grinning, Hawks said, A gambler has to know how to figure things. And it's written in permoscript all over your forehead anyway. You're wondering what the first face-to-face meeting's going to be like. I'll bet on it. I won't cover the bet. You'd win. You want to know how it'll be? I can tell you, Alan. You'll feel sick. Sick and bewildered and ashamed of the guy who used to be your brother. But that'll pass. You'll look behind the things the 9 years did to him, and you'll see that your brother's back there. He'll see you too. It won't be as bad as you're expecting. Somehow Alan felt relieved. You sure of that? Hawks nodded. You know, I'm taking such a personal interest in this business because I've got a brother too. Had a brother. Had? Kid about your age, same problem I had too. No guild. We were born into the Street Sweepers Guild, but neither of us could go for that, so we checked out and we took free status. I went into gambling. He hung around the Enclave. He always wanted to be a spacer. What happened to him? He pulled a fast one. Starship was in town and looking for a new galley boy. Dave did some glib talking and got aboard. It was a fluke thing, but he made it. Which ship? Alan asked. Star Treader, bound out on a hop to Beta Crucis 18. 465 light years. Hawks smiled faintly. He left a year and a half ago. The ship won't be back on Earth again for some 930 years or so. I don't figure to be around that long. He shook his head. Let's get out of here. People waiting for tables. Out on the street again, Alan noticed that the sun was low in the sky. It was past 1800 and getting along toward evening. But the streets were not getting dark. From everywhere a soft glow was beginning to radiate. From the pavement, the buildings, everywhere. It was a gentle, gleaming brightness that fell from the air. There was no perceptible change from day illumination to night illumination. But it was getting late, and they would miss him back at the Enclave, unless Captain Donnell had discovered that Alan had gone into the Earther City, in which case he wouldn't be missed at all. Alan remembered sharply the way the captain had calmly blotted the name of his son Steve from Valhalla's roster, as if Steve had never existed. Are we going to go over to the Atlas now? Hawks shook his head. Not unless you want to go in there alone. Huh? I can't go in there with you. I've got an A card, and that's a Class C joint. You mean even gambling places are classified and regulated and everything? Hawks nodded. It has to be that way. This is a very complicated society you've stumbled into, Alan. Look, I'm a first-rate gamesman. That's not boasting. It's empirical truth proven over and over again during the course of a 15-year career. I could make a fortune competing against beginners and dubs and has-beens, so they legislate against me. You make a certain annual income from gambling and you go into Class A, and then you can't enter any of the lower class joints like the Atlas. You slip under the Class A minimum 3 years in a row and you lose your card. I stay over the minimum. So I'll have to go after Steve myself? Well, in that case, thanks for all your help, and if you'll show me which chute I take to get to the Atlas... Not so fast, son. Hawks grasped Alan's wrist. Even in a Class C dump, you can lose plenty, and you can't just stand around hunting for your brother. Unless you're there as a learner, you'll have to play. So what am I supposed to do? I'll take you to a Class A place tonight. You can come in as a learner. They all know me. I'll try to show you enough about the game so you don't get rooked. Then you can stay over at my place, and tomorrow we'll go up to the Atlas and look around for your brother. I'll have to wait outside, of course. Alan shrugged. He was beginning to realize he was a little nervous about the coming meeting with Steve, and perhaps, he thought, a little extra delay would be useful. And he still had plenty of time to get back to the Valhalla after he saw Steve, even if he stayed in the city overnight. "Well?" Hawks said. "Okay, I'll go with you." This time they took the undertube, which they reached by following a glowing sign, and then an underground passageway. Alan rode down behind Hawks on the moving ramp and found himself in a warm, brightly lit underground world, with stores, restaurants, newsboys hawking telefax sheets, milling swarms of homebound commuters. They reached the entrance to a tube, and Hawks handed him a small oval object, with figures engraved on it. "That's your tube token. It goes in the slot." They passed through the turnstile and followed the signs indicated to the west side tube. The tube was a long, sleek affair, windowless, shaped like a bullet. The tube was already packed with commuters when they got on board. There were no empty seats, of course, and everyone seemed to be jostling everyone else for the right to stand upright. The sign at the end of the tube said, "Tube X3174 WS." The trip took only a few minutes of seemingly effortless gliding, and then they emerged far on the other side of the giant city. The neighborhood there was considerably less crowded. It had little of the mad hubbub of the downtown district. A neon sign struck his eyes at once. "Superior Games Parlor." Under that in smaller letters was "Class A Establishment." A robot stood outside, a gleaming replica of the one he had tussled with earlier in the day. "Class A only," the robot said as they came near. "This games parlor is for Class A only." Hawks stepped around him and broke the photo contact on the door. Alan followed him in. The place was dimly lit, as all Earther pleasure places seemed to be. Alan saw a double row of tables spreading to the back of the parlor. At each table was an earnest-looking citizen hunched over a board, watching the pattern of lights in front of him come and go, change and shift. Another robot glided up to them. "May I see your card, please?" it purred. Hawks passed his card before the robot's photonic scanners, and the robot clicked acknowledgement, stepping to one side and letting Hawks pass. It turned to Alan and said, "May I see your card, please?" "I don't—" "He's with me," Hawks said. "A learner." A man in a dirty gray smock came up to them. "Evening, Max. Heinze was already here and told me you weren't coming in tonight." "I wasn't, but I changed my mind. I brought a learner along with me, friend of mine, name of Alan Donnell. This is Joe Luckman, Alan. He runs this place." Luckman nodded absently to Alan, who mumbled a greeting in return. "Guess you want your usual table?" Luckman asked. "If it's open," Hawks said. "Been open all evening." Luckman led them down the long aisle to the back of the big hall, where there was a vacant table with one seat before it. Hawks slid smoothly into the seat and told Alan to stand behind him and watch carefully. "We'll start at the beginning of the next round," he said. Alan looked around. Everywhere men were bent over the patterns of lights on the boards before them, with expressions of fierce concentration on their face. Far in the corner, Alan saw the pudgy figure of Mackintosh, the keeper of the records. Mackintosh was bathed in his own sweat, and sat rigid as if hypnotized. Hawks nudged him. "Keep your eyes on me. The others don't matter. I'm ready to get started." Chapter 9. Hawks took a coin from his pocket and dropped it into a slot at the side of the board. It lit up. A crazy, shifting pattern of colored lights passed over it, restless, never pausing. "What happens now?" "You set up a mathematical pattern with these keys," Hawks said, pointing to a row of enameled studs along the side of the machine. "Then the lights start flashing, and as soon as they flash, at random of course, into the pattern you've previously set up, you're the winner." The skill of the game comes in predicting the kind of pattern that will be the winning one. You've got to keep listening to the numbers that the croupier calls off and fit them into your sequence. Suddenly a bell rang loudly and the board went dead. Alan looked around and saw that all the other boards in the hall were dark as well. The man on the rostrum in the center of the hall cleared his throat and sang out, "Table 403 hits us for 100. 403, 100. A pasty-faced bald man at a table near theirs rose with a broad grin on his face and went forward to collect. Hawks rapped sharply on the side of the table to get Alan's attention. "Look here now, you have to get a head start. As soon as the boards light up again, I have to begin setting up my pattern. I'm competing against everyone else here, you see? And the quickest man wins, usually. Of course, blind luck sometimes brings you a winner, but not very often." Alan nodded and watched carefully as Hawk's fingers flew nimbly over the controlling studs the instant the tables lit for the next round. The others nearby were busy doing the same thing, but few of them set about it with the air of cocky jauntiness that Hawks wore. Finally he stared at the board in satisfaction and sat back. The croupier pounded 3 times with a little gavel and said 103, subprime 5. Hastily Hawks made a correction in his equation. The lights on the board flickered and faded, moving faster than Alan could see. 377, third quadrant, 7. Again a correction. Hawks sat transfixed, staring intently at the board. The other players were similarly entranced, Alan saw. He realized it was possible for someone to become virtually hypnotized by the game, to spend days on end sitting before the board. He forced himself to follow Hawk's computations as number after number was called. He began to see the logical pattern of the game. It was a little like astrogation, in which he had had the required preliminary instruction. When you worked out a ship's course, you had to keep altering it to allow for course deflection, effects of planetary magnetic fields, meteor swarms, and such obstacles, and you had to be one jump ahead of the obstacles all the time. It was the same here. The pilot board at the croupier's rostrum had a prearranged mathematical pattern on it. The idea of the game was to set up your board in the identical pattern. As each succeeding coordinate on the graph was called out, you recomputed in terms of the new probabilities, rubbing out old equations and substituting new ones. There was always the mathematical chance that a pattern set up at random would be identical to the master control pattern, but that was a pretty slim chance. It took brains to win this game. The man whose board was first to match the pilot pattern won. Hawks worked quietly, efficiently, and lost the first 4 rounds. Alan commiserated. But the gamblers snapped, "Don't waste your pity. I'm still experimenting. As soon as I've figured out the way the numbers are running tonight, I'll start raking it in." It sounded boastful to the Starman, but Hawks won on the 5th round, matching the hidden pattern in only 6 minutes. The previous 4 rounds had taken from 9 to 12 minutes before a winner appeared. The croupier, a small, sallow-faced chap, shoved a stack of coins and a few bills at Hawks when he went to the rostrum to claim his winnings. A low murmur rippled through the hall. Hawks evidently had been recognized. His take was 100 credits. In less than an hour he was already 75 credits to the good. Hawks' sharp eyes glinted brightly. He was in his element now, and enjoying it. The 6th round went to a bespectacled, round-faced man 3 tables to the left, but Hawks won 100 credits each on the 7th and 8th rounds, then lost 3 in a row, then plunged for a heavy stake in his 9th round and came out ahead by 500 credits. So Hawks had won 4 times in 9 rounds, Alan thought, and there were at least 100 people in the hall. Even assuming the gambler did not always have the sort of luck he was having now, that meant most people did not win very often, and some did not win at all. As the evening went along, Hawks made it look simple. At one point he won 4 rounds in a row. Then he dropped back off for a while, but came back for another big pot half an hour later. Alan estimated Hawks' night's work had been worth more than 1,000 credits so far. The gambler pushed his winnings to 1,400 credits while Alan watched, the fine points of the game becoming more comprehensible to him with each passing moment, and he longed to sit down at the table himself. That was impossible, he knew. This was a Class A parlor, and a rank beginner such as himself could not play. But then Hawks began to lose. 3, 4, 5 rounds in a row slipped by without a win. At one point Hawks committed an elementary mistake in arithmetic that made Alan cry out. Hawks turned and silenced him with a fierce, bleak scowl, and Alan went red. 6 rounds, 7, 8. Hawks had lost nearly 100 of his 1,400 credits. Luck and skill seemed to have deserted him simultaneously. After the 11th consecutive losing round, Hawks rose from the table, shaking his head bitterly. "I've had enough. Let's get out of here." He pocketed his winnings, still a healthy 1,200 credits, despite his late evening slump, and Alan followed him out of the parlor into the night. It was late now, past midnight. The streets, fresh and clean, were damp. It had rained while they were in the parlor, and Alan realized wryly that he had been so absorbed by the game that he had not even noticed. Crowds of home-going Yorkers moved rapidly through the streets. As they made their way to the nearest Undertube terminal, Alan broke the silence. "You did all right tonight, didn't you?" "Can't complain." "It's too bad you had that slump right at the end. If you'd quit half an hour earlier, you'd be 200 credits richer." Hawks smiled. "If you'd been born a couple 100 years later, you'd be a lot smarter." What is that supposed to mean? Alan felt annoyed by Hawks' remark. "Simply that I lost deliberately toward the end." They turned into the Undertube station and headed for the ticket windows. It's part of a smart gambler's know-how to drop a few credits deliberately now and then. "Why?" "So the jerks who provide my living keep on coming back," Hawks said bluntly. "I'm good at the game. Maybe I'm the best there is. I can feel the numbers with my hands. If I wanted to, I could win 4 out of 5 times, even at a Class A place." Alan frowned. "Then why don't you? You could get rich." "I am rich," Hawks said in a tone that made Alan feel tremendously foolish. "If I got much richer too fast, I'd wind up with a soft burn in the belly from a disgruntled customer. Look here, boy, how long would you go back to that casino if one player took 80% of the pots, and 100 people competed with you for the 20% he left over? You'd win maybe once a month if you played full-time every day. In a short time you'd be broke, unless you quit playing first. So, I ease up. I let the others win about half the time. I don't want all the money the mint turns out, just some of it. It's part of the economics of the game to let the other guys take a few pots." Alan nodded. He understood. "And you don't want to make them too jealous of you. So you made sure you lost consistently for the final half hour or so, and that took the edge off your earlier winning in their minds. That's the ticket." The Undertube pulled out of the station and shot bullet-like through its dark tunnel. Silently, Alan thought about his night's experience. He saw he still had much, very much to learn about life on Earth. Hawks had a gift, the gift of winning. He didn't abuse that gift. He concealed it a little so people who lacked his talent did not get too jealous of him. Jealousy ran high on Earth. People here led short, ugly lives, and there was none of the serenity and friendship of life aboard a starship. He felt very tired, but it was just physical fatigue. He felt wide awake mentally. Earth life, for all its squalor and brutality, was tremendously exciting compared with shipboard existence. It was with a momentary pang of something close to disappointment that he remembered he would have to report back to the Valhalla in several days. There were so many fascinating aspects of Earth life he still wanted to explore. The Undertube stopped at a station labeled Hasbrook. "This is where we get off," Hawks told him. They took a slide walk to street level. The street was like a canyon with towering walls looming up all around, and some of the gigantic buildings seemed quite shabby looking by the street light. Obviously they were in a less respectable part of the city. "This is Hasbrook," Hawks said. "It's a residential section, and that's where I live." He pointed to the tarnished chrome entrance of one of the biggest and shabbiest of the buildings on the street. "Be it ever so humble, there's no place like North Hasbrook Arms. It's the sleaziest, cheapest, most run-down tenement in one hemisphere, but I love it. It's a real palace." Alan followed him through a gate that had once been imposing. Now it swung open rather rustily as they broke the photobeam in front of it. The lobby was dark and dimly lit, and smelled faintly musty. Alan was unprepared for the shabbiness of the house where the gambler lived. A moment after he spoke, he realized the question was highly impertinent, but by then it was too late. "I don't understand, Max. If you make so much money gambling, why do you live in a place like this? Aren't there any better, I mean—" An unreadable expression flitted briefly across the gambler's lean face. "I know what you mean. Let's just say that the laws of this planet discriminate slightly against free-status people like yours truly. They require us to live in approved residences. But this is practically a slum." "Forget the practically. This is the raw end of town, and no denying it. But I have to live here." They entered a creaky old elevator decorated with too much chrome, most of it chipped, and Hawks pressed 106. "When I first moved here, I made up my mind I'd bribe my way into a fancier neighborhood as soon as I had the cash. But by the time I had enough to spare, I didn't feel like moving, you see. I'm sort of lazy." The elevator stopped with a jarring jolt at the 106th floor. They passed down a narrow, poorly lit corridor. Hawks paused suddenly in front of a door, pressed his thumb against the door plate, and waited as it swung open in response to the imprint of his fingerprint against the sensitive electronic grid. "Here we are," he said. It was a 3-room apartment that looked almost as old and as disreputable as the rooms in the Enclave. But the furniture was new and attractive. These were not the rooms of a poor man. An elaborate audio system took up one entire wall. Elsewhere, Alan saw books of all kinds, tapes, a tiny mounted globe of light sculpture within whose crystal interior abstract colors flowed kaleidoscopically, a handsome robot bar. Hawks gestured Alan to a seat. Alan chose a green lounge chair with quivering springs and stretched out. He did not want to go to sleep. He wanted to stay up half the night and talk. The gambler busied himself at the bar a moment and returned with 2 drinks. Alan looked at the glass a moment. The drink was bright yellow in color, sparkling. He sipped it. The flavor was gentle but striking, a mixture of 2 or 3 tastes and textures that chased each other around Alan's tongue. "I like it. What is it?" "Wine from Antares 13. I bought it for 100 credits a bottle last year. I still have 3 bottles left, too. I go easy on it. The next ship from Antares 13 won't be in for 14 more years." The drink made Alan mellow and relaxed. They talked a while, and he hardly noticed the fact that the time was getting along toward 0300 now, long past his ship-time bunk hour. He didn't care. He listened to every word Hawks had to say, drinking it in with the same delight he felt when drinking the Antarian wine. Hawks was a complex, many-faceted character. He seemed to have been everywhere on Earth, done everything the planet had to offer. And yet there was no boastfulness in his tone as he spoke of his exploits. He was simply stating fact. Apparently his income from gambling was staggering. He averaged nearly 1,000 credits a night, night in and night out. But a note of plaintiveness crept into his voice. Success was boring him. He had no further goals to shoot for. He stood at the top of his profession, and there were no new worlds for him to conquer. He had seen and done everything, and lamented it. "I'd like to go to space someday," he remarked. "But of course that's out. I wouldn't want to rip myself away from year 3876 forever. You don't know what I'd give to see the suns come up over Albeiro 5, or to watch the 1,000 moons of Capella 16. But I can't do it." He shook his head gravely. "Well, I better not dream. I like Earth, and I like the sort of life I lead. And I'm glad I ran into you, too. We'll make a good team, you and me, Donnell." Alan had been lulled by the sound of Hawk's voice, but he snapped to attention now, surprised. "Team? What are you talking about?" "I'll take you on as my protege, make a decent gambler out of you, set you up. We can go traveling together, see the world again. You've been to space. You can tell me what it's like out there, and—" "Hold on," Alan said sharply. "You've got things mixed up a little bit. I'm going to Procyon on the Valhalla at the end of this week. I appreciate everything you've done for me, but if you think I'm going to jump ship permanently and spend the rest of my life—" "You'll stay on Earth, all right," Hawk said confidently. "You're in love with the place. You know yourself you don't want to spend the next 7 decades of your life shuttling around in your old man's starship. You'll check out and stay here. I know you will." "I'll bet you I don't." "That bet is herewith covered," Hawks drawled. "I never pass up a sure thing. Is 10 to 1 okay? Your 100 against my 1,000 that you'll stay?" Alan scowled angrily. "I don't want to bet with you, Max. I'm going back on the Valhalla. Go ahead, take my money if you're so sure." "All right, I will. 1,000 credits won't hurt me." Suddenly he had no further desire to listen to Hawk's talk. He rose abruptly and gulped down the remainder of his drink. "I'm tired. Let's get some sleep." "Fair enough," Hawks said. He got up, touched a button in the wall, and a panel slid back, exposing a bed. "You sack out here. I'll wake you in the morning and we'll go looking for your brother Steve." Chapter 10. Alan woke early the next morning, but it was Rat, not Hawks, who pulled him out of sleep. The little extraterrestrial was nibbling on his ear. Bleary-eyed, Alan sat up and blinked. "Oh, it's you. I thought you were on a silent strike." "There wasn't anything I wanted to say, so I kept quiet. But I want to say some things now, before your friend wakes up." The Bellatrician had been silent all the past evening, tagging along behind Alan and Hawks like a faithful pet, but keeping his mouth closed. "Go ahead and say them then," Alan said. "I don't like this fellow Hawks. I think you're in for trouble if you stick with him." "He's going to take me to Atlas to get Steve." "You can get to Atlas yourself. He's given you all the help you'll need." Alan shook his head. "I'm no baby. I can take care of myself, without your help." The little alien creature shrugged. "Suit yourself. But I'll tell you one thing, Alan. I'm going back to the Valhalla whether you are or not. I don't like Earth. Or Hawks either. Remember that." "Who said I was staying here? Didn't you hear me bet Max that I'd go back?" "I heard you. I say you're going to lose that bet. I say this Hawks is going to fast talk you into staying here, and if I had any need for money I'd put down a side bet on Hawks' side." Alan laughed. You think you know me better than I know myself? I never for a minute thought of jumping ship. Has my advice ever steered you wrong? I'm older than you are, Alan. I'm 10 or 20 times smarter. I can see where you're heading, and... Alan grew suddenly angry. Nag, nag, nag. You're worse than an old woman. Why don't you keep quiet the way you did last night and leave me alone? I know what I'm doing, and when I want your advice, I'll ask for it. Have it your way, Rat said. His tone was mildly reproachful. Alan felt abashed at having scolded the little alien that way, but he did not know how to make proper amends. Besides, he was annoyed at Rat's preachiness. He and Rat had been together too long. The Bellatrician probably thought he was still only 10 years old and in need of constant advice. He rolled over and went back to sleep. About an hour later he was awakened again, this time by Hawks. He dressed and they ate. Good real food, no synthetics, served by Hawks' Auto Chef, and then set out for the Atlas Games Parlor, 68th Avenue and 423rd Street, in Upper York City. The time was 13:27 when they emerged on the street. Hawks assured him that Steve would already be at work. Most unsuccessful gamblers started making the rounds of the parlors in early afternoon. They took the Undertube back to the heart of the city and kept going into the suburb of Upper York. Getting out at the 423rd Street terminal, they walked briskly through the narrow, crowded streets toward 68th Avenue. When they were a block away, Alan spotted the sign blinking on and off in watery red letters, Atlas Games Parlor. A smaller sign proclaimed the parlor's status Class C, which allowed any mediocre player to make use of its facility. As they drew near, Alan felt a tingle of excitement. This was what he had come to the Earther City for in the first place, to find Steve. For weeks he had been picturing the circumstances of this meeting. Now it was about to take place. The Atlas was similar to the other games parlor, where Alan had had the set too with the robo-huckster. It was dark-windowed, and a shining blue robot stood outside, urging passerby to step inside and try their luck. Alan moistened his dry lips. He felt cold and numb inside. He won't be there, he thought. He won't be there. Hawks took a wad of bills from his wallet. Here's 200 credits for you to use at the tables while you're looking around. I'll have to wait outside. There'd be a royal uproar if a Class A man ever set foot inside a place like the Atlas. Alan smiled nervously. He was pleased that Hawks was unable to come with him. He wanted to handle the problem by himself for a change. And he was not anxious for the gambler to witness the scene between him and Steve. If Steve were inside, that is. He nodded tightly and walked toward the door. The robo-huckster outside chattered at him. Come right on in, sir. Step inside. 5 credits can get you 100 here. Right this way. I'm going, Alan said. He passed through the photo beam and into the games parlor. Another robot came sliding up to him and scanned his features. This is a Class C establishment, sir. If your card is any higher than a Class C, you cannot compete here. Would you mind showing me your card, sir? I don't have any. I'm an unrated beginner. That was what Hawks had told him to say. I'd like a single table, please. He was shown to a table to the left of the croupier's booth. The Atlas was a good bit dingier than the Class A parlor he had been in the night before. Its electroluminescent light panels fizzed and sputtered, casting uncertain shadows here and there. A round was in progress. Figures were bent busily over their boards, altering their computations and changing their light patterns. Alan slid a 5-credit piece into the slot, while waiting for the round to finish and the next to begin, looked around at his fellow patrons. In the semi-dark that prevailed, it was difficult to make out faces. He would have trouble recognizing Steve. A musky odor hung low over the hall, sweet, pungent. yet somehow unpleasant. He realized he had experienced that odor before, and tried to remember. Yes, last night in the other games parlor he had smelled a wisp of the fragrance, and Hawks had told him it was a narcotic cigarette. It lay heavy in the stale air of the Class C parlor. Patrons stared with fanatic intensity at the racing patterns of light before them. Alan glanced from one to the next. A bald head whose dome glinted bright gold in the dusk knotted his hands together in an anguish of indecision. A slim, dreamy-eyed young man gripped the sides of the table, frenzied as the numbers spiraled upward. A fat woman in her late 40s, hopelessly dazed by the intricate game, slumped wearily in her seat. Beyond that he could not see. There were other patrons on the far side of the rostrum. Perhaps Steve was over there. But it was forbidden for anyone to wander through the rows of tables searching for a particular player. The gong rang, ending the round. "Number 322 wins 100 credits," barked the croupier. The man at table 322 shambled forward for his money. He walked with a twisted shuffle, his body shook palsiedly. Hawks had warned him of these, too, the dream dust addicts, who in the late stages of their addiction became hollow shells of men barely able to walk. He took his 100 credits and returned to his table without smiling. Alan shuddered and looked away. Earth was not a pretty world. Life was good if you had the stream running with you, as Hawks did, but for each successful one like Hawks, how many fought unsuccessfully against the current and were swept away into dream dust, or worse. Steve. He looked down the row for Steve. And then the board lit up again, and for the first time he was playing. He set up a tentative pattern. Gold streaks flitted across the board, mingling with red and blue blinkers. Then the first number came. Alan integrated it hastily and realized he had constructed a totally worthless pattern. He wiped the board clean and set up new figures, based on the one number he already had. Already he knew he was hopelessly far behind the others. But he kept with it as the minutes crawled past. Sweat dribbled down his face and neck. He had none of Hawk's easy confidence with the board's controls. This game was hard work for a beginner. Later, perhaps, some of the steps would become automatic, but now... 78 sub 12 over 13, came the droning instructions, and Alan pulled levers and twisted ratchets to keep his pattern true. He saw the attraction the game held for the people of Earth. It required such deep concentration, such careful attention, that one had no time to ponder other problems. It was impossible to think and compete at the same time. The game offered perfect escape from the harsh realities of Earther existence. 612 Sigma 5. Again Alan recompensated. His nerves tingled. He felt he must be close to victory. All thought of what he had come here for slipped away. Steve was forgotten. Only the flashing board counted, only the game. 5 more numbers went by. Suddenly the gong rang, indicating that someone had achieved a winning pattern, and it was like the fall of a headsman's axe to Alan. He had lost. That was all he could think of. He had lost. The winner was a dreamy-eyed youth at table 166, who accepted his winnings without a word and took his seat. As Alan drew out another 5-credit piece for the next round, he realized what he was doing. He was being caught up in the nerve-stretching excitement of the game. He was forgetting Steve, forgetting the waiting Hawks outside. He stretched back in his seat and peered as far down the row as he could see. No sign of Steve there. He had to be on the other side of the croupier. Alan decided to do his best to win. That way he could advance to the rostrum and scan the other half of the hall. But the game fled by too quickly. He made a false computation on the 11th number, and watched in dismay as his pattern drew further and further away from the numbers being called off. He drove himself furiously, trying to make amends, but it was impossible. The winner was the man at table 217 on the other side. He was a lantern-jawed giant with a powerful frame of a longshoreman, and he laughed in pleasure as he collected his money. 3 more rounds went by. Alan picked up increasing skill at the game, but failed to win. He saw his shortcoming, but he could do nothing to help it. He was unable to extrapolate ahead. Hawks was gifted with the knack of being able to extend probable patterns 2 or 3 moves into the future. Alan could only work with the given, and so he never made the swift series of guesses which led to victory. He had spent nearly an hour in the parlor now, fruitlessly. The next round came and went. "Table 111 takes us for 150 credits," came the croupier's cry. Alan relaxed, waiting for the lucky winner to collect and for the next round to begin. The winner reached the centrally located rostrum. Alan looked at him. He was tall, fairly young, in his 30s perhaps, with stooped shoulders and a dull glazedness about his eyes. He looked familiar. Steve. Feeling no excitement now that the quest had reached success, Alan slipped from his seat and made his way around the croupier's rostrum and down the far aisle. Steve had already taken his seat at table 111. Alan came up behind him just as the gong sounded to signal the new round. Steve was hunched over the board, calculating with almost desperate fury. Alan touched his shoulder. "Steve?" Without looking up, Steve snapped, "Get out of here, whoever you are. Can't you see I'm busy?" "Steve, I—" A robot sidled up to Alan and grabbed him firmly by the arm. "It is forbidden to disturb the players while they are engaged in a game. We will have to eject you from this parlor." Angrily, Alan broke loose from the robot's grasp and leaned over Steve. He shook him by the shoulder roughly, trying to shake loose his mind from the flickering games board. "Steve, look up! It's me, Alan, your brother." Steve slapped at Alan's hand as he would at a fly. Alan saw other robots converging on him from various points in the room. In a minute they'd hurl him out into the street. Recklessly, he grabbed Steve by the shoulders and spun him around in his seat. A curse tumbled from Steve's lips, then fell strangely silent. "You remember me, Steve? Your brother Alan? Your twin brother once?" Steve had changed, certainly. His hair was no longer thick and curly. It seemed to have straightened out and darkened a little. Wrinkles seamed his forehead, his eyes were deep-set and surrounded by lines. He was slightly overweight, and it showed. He looked terribly tired. Looking at him was like looking at a comic mirror that distorted and altered your features. But there was nothing comic about Steve's appearance. In a hoarse whisper he said, "Alan?" "Yes?" Alan felt robot arms grasping him firmly. He struggled to break loose and saw Steve trying to say something, only no words were coming. Steve was very pale. "Let go of him," Steve said finally. He wasn't disturbing me." "He must be ejected. It is the rule." Conflict traced deep lines on Steve's face. "All right then, we'll both leave." The robots released Alan, who rubbed his arms ruefully. Together they walked up the aisle and out into the street. Hawks stood waiting there. "I see you've found him. It took long enough." Max, this is my brother, Stephen Donnell." Alan's voice was shaky with tension. "Steve, this is a friend of mine, Max Hawks." "You don't need to tell me who he is," Steve said. His voice was deeper and harsher than Alan remembered it. "Every gamesman knows Hawks. He's the best there is." In the warm daylight, Steve looked even older than his 26 years that was his chronological age. To Alan's eyes, he seemed to be a man who had been kicked around by life, a man who had not yet given up, but who knew he didn't stand much of a chance for the future. And he looked ashamed. The old sparkle was gone from his brother's eyes. Quietly, Steve said, "Okay, Alan, you tracked me down. Call me whatever names you want to call me and let me get about my business. I don't do quite as well as your friend Hawks, and I happen to be in need of a lot of cash in a hurry." "I didn't come to call you names. Let's go someplace where we can talk," Alan said. "There's a lot for us to talk about."